Hello everybody. Just because we discussed this a long time ago, and as a reminder of the rationale and the very spirit of the Our World series, we are going to go through some of the concepts we discussed in part one. So, mainly today we are going to focus our attention on the differences between L1 and EFL acquisition that should gear instruction in the classroom, and we are going to discuss best practices when it comes to teaching English to young learners. To begin with, and as a reminder, we talked about the similarities between L1 and L2 that really mattered in the classroom. We said that in both first and second language acquisition, making errors is part of learning. Students' errors will reflect the hypotheses they are making about language. Also, we discussed that in the initial stages of learning, learners use chunks of language without breaking them down or processing them as independent units, which means that students really benefit from these chunks of prefabricated language, which, used in context, will give them an idea of what they mean, and not necessarily do they need to break them into words. They will understand the function of the whole chunk. In both first and second language acquisition, the learner uses context clues, prior knowledge, and interaction to comprehend language. This is the very spirit of our world. You will see that students will learn language which is beautifully contextualized, and of course there will be lots of instances of interaction in the classroom so that they can make, of course, sense of everything they are learning. Also, we said that in both first and second language acquisition, age is an important variable affecting proficiency. Young learners are really very good language learners. So this is why our world begins to be used with very young children. In both first and second language acquisition, learners can, of course, often comprehend more complex language than the one they can actually use. But what we need to remember is that language has to be comprehensible. Comprehensible input is absolutely necessary to young learners to learn the language. And we also said that in the initial stages of learning, learners seem to go through this silent period where they are not this active, but actually it's not a passive role at all. And last but not least, in both first and second language acquisition, learners need comprehensible input. So it is really very important that teachers, language teachers of young learners, make themselves understood by using gestures, body language, lots of visuals, okay? And sometimes even bringing the real objects to the classroom. Now, just as we have similarities, we have differences between L1 and L2 that really matter in the classroom. In first language acquisition, children spend several years listening to language and then babbling and using telegraphic speech before they can form sentences. And then, of course, because L2 is learned in a classroom, students will have fewer opportunities to learn the language authentically. So it is really very important that although we know that learning is artificial because it's a classroom with a teacher and students, we try to make learning as natural as possible to benefit learning. Acquiring a first language happens naturally, while acquiring a second language often requires, of course, conscious effort. Just we need to remember that young learners learn by playing, by doing, in joyful and playful activities. So we have to provide for that. You will soon see how the World Series provides for all that. Now, having stated this, we need to remember when teaching young learners that mainly at the very beginning they will be reproducing the language. And here I need to state that this is not parroting the language, but reproducing. And what's the difference? When students parrot the language, they repeat with no understanding of what they are saying. Now, it is fundamental for the acquisition of language that students understand what they are repeating. That is why when we teach them songs, when we teach them chants or poems, we have to try to do it with body language and gestures so that there is a connection between what students are saying and this body gesture or movement that will remind them of the meaning. So remember, mostly when they are very young, they will be reproducing language, but it is fundamental that they understand. So the context in which this language is presented is vital. As children progress in their learning, they mainly reproduce, but then they also produce. And production will increase, of course. And what will this depend on? Of course, this reproduction and production will strongly depend on the efficient strategies and efficient instruction from the teacher. So let's see. When it comes to reproducing the language, and as I said before, this has to do with repeating the language, but with a full understanding of what students are saying, we need to remember how critical the comprehensible input is. We need to remember to make ourselves understood and to provide students with materials that they can understand. We must also remember that our students are mostly visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, so we need to make the learning of everything multisensory. We have to teach them songs and chants and poems and everyday language, and we have to use the language in these songs, chants, poems, and chunks really comprehensible by embedding them in clear contexts. And of course, if these songs and chants and language are presented together with a topic that contextualizes everything, it makes absolute sense to the learners. Now, when it comes to production of language, we need to remember that students will initially communicate by using words, and then they will make combinations with all those words, and they will also use some short phrases, and then they will also strongly rely on chunks of prefabricated language or language frames presented by the teacher. Now, we said that initially students use words, sometimes one word, to represent a whole thought. So words are the building blocks of language production. Now, here we need to stop for a little while to talk about efficient vocabulary instruction. So here I need to remind you that our students, in fact all of us, have a mental lexicon. And our mental lexicon looks like a very neat wardrobe. That is to say, every time we learn a new word, we know exactly where to go and put it. And that place where we are going to put that word will strongly depend on what we've got in our schemata. That is to say, what do we relate that word with? So, for example, if I'm learning the new word lion and I know that the lion lives in the savannah, I will probably put the word into the drawer that says savanna animals. So this is clearly saying that every time we learn new words, we classify and sort and put things away following a given criteria. Now, this criteria will vary from individual to individual. So our mental lexicon is a very neat wardrobe. We sort, classify, group together, and we use different criteria. Now, have you ever put something away so well that then you don't remember where you put it? Well, this is exactly what happens when we learn a new word and we don't have many opportunities to use that word. We just put it in our mental lexicon, and then when it comes to using it, we cannot retrieve, we cannot find the words. So this is clearly telling us that efficient vocabulary instruction will be that which will present the new words in a context. And then, of course, give students instances for practicing these new words. But of course, the most important stage is that one in which students will be applying those words in a number of very meaningful situations. And this is the spirit of our world, and we are going to see it afterwards. So, how do students get to own the words? Through meaningful repetition, and of course with meaningful opportunities to use these words. Now, language output does not only rely on words. Students also need structural language. And structural language refers to these prefabricated chunks that teachers are going to present in a clear context so that students can work out what the function of that chunk is. So in a nutshell, which are the practices that benefit EFL acquisition? Comprehensible input. Teachers need to remember to make themselves understood and to present students with comprehensible material. Systematic and purposeful teaching of vocabulary and structural language. That is to say, presentation, always in a context, practice, because practice makes perfect, and then of course, application, giving students several meaningful instances where they can put everything to the test. And then of course, opportunities to use vocabulary and structural languages. The more students use them, the more chances they have to internalize them. Stories provide a wonderful context for the teaching, for the practice, and for the application of new words and structures. That's another asset of the Our World series, and we are going to see it afterwards. The reading-writing connection is another feature of the book. How writing becomes responsive to reading. What students understand as readers will have an impact on what they do as writers. And last but not least, remembering that young learners really do not benefit from formulas and grammar and drills and all that stuff, but they better benefit from grammar being used in context so clear that they can work out the function of the different chunks they are presented with. So this is the end of first part, something that we had already gone through together in our part 1, which has to do with the best practices for teaching English to young learners. So what we are going to do in a little while is a unit walkthrough of the Our World series and its components, so that you can see that the layout of the book and the materials goes hand in hand with all this theory we have already discussed.